Mexico saying it does not want a trade deal with the U.S. if it means leaving Canada behind. How significant is that message?
Welcome to Canada TradEconomics. Trump put CUSMA into zombie mode. We previously explained how Washington's refusal to grant a clean extension transformed North American trade from a stable long-term agreement into a permanent negotiation. CUSMA is still alive. Goods still cross the borders. Factories are still operating. Trucks still move between Canada, the United States and Mexico. But the certainty that gave the agreement its value has been weakened. Now we are beginning to see what that strategy looks like in practice. Washington is negotiating with Mexico and Canada on separate tracks. Mexico is already moving toward another bilateral round with the United States, while Canada remains on a slower and less clearly defined path. But Mexico has now drawn a line. It says it does not want a new trade arrangement with Washington if that means leaving Canada behind. That sounds like solidarity. But there is a catch. Mexico is not refusing to negotiate separately with the United States. It is already doing exactly that. What Mexico appears to be resisting is the transformation of those separate negotiations into a permanent two-country trade system that pushes Canada outside the North American architecture. So the real question is not simply whether Mexico supports Canada. It is whether Canada and Mexico can preserve one trilateral economic system while Washington negotiates with them one at a time. Let's listen to this perspective.
I think it's very significant. I think there was always a very strong understanding that it is a trilateral arrangement. This is a North American free trade arrangement that actually has worked well since the outset.
That distinction is important. CUSMA is not simply one Canadian agreement with the United States and another Mexican agreement with the United States, placed inside the same document. It is a three-country production system. The automotive industry makes that clear. A vehicle assembled in Mexico may contain Canadian steel, aluminium or minerals, American electronics and components manufactured across several locations. Some parts cross borders more than once before a finished vehicle reaches a dealership. Canadian energy supports American industry. American capital and consumer demand support factories in Canada and Mexico. Mexican assembly capacity helps North America compete with Europe and Asia. The system works because the three countries do not merely exchange finished products. They make things together. That is why bilateral negotiations can have trilateral consequences. A rule agreed between Washington and Mexico on automotive content could affect Canadian parts manufacturers. A U.S Mexico agreement involving steel or aluminium could alter the position of Canadian mills. A decision involving agriculture, labor standards, or economic security could reshape supply chains across the entire continent. Canada may not be present in a particular room, but Canadian industries can still be affected by what is decided there. This is the deeper meaning of CUSMA's zombie mode. The agreement does not have to die for its structure to weaken. It can remain formally trilateral, while its most important sectors are reopened through bilateral negotiations. Washington can pressure Mexico over automobiles. It can pressure Canada over dairy, energy, digital trade or industrial policy. It can demand different concessions from each country. Then it can bring those separate outcomes back into one agreement that no longer treats all three partners in the same way. Listen to this explanation.
I think it's an important message actually to the White House that we either work together or we don't. And I think it's extremely important to the benefit of the United States that they recognize the value of us working together.
That is the message Mexico is sending. Separate disputes can be discussed separately, but separate negotiations must not become separate economic worlds. The problem is that Washington has strong incentives to negotiate one country at a time. The United States is by far the largest market in the agreement. That gives it the ability to offer Mexico one set of terms and Canada another. It can move quickly with the country that appears more willing to compromise. It can delay talks with the country resisting American demands. And once one neighbor accepts a new arrangement, Washington can use that outcome as pressure against the other. This is why Mexico's statement matters for Canada. Without Mexican resistance, Washington could reach a broad understanding with Mexico first, settle the issues most important to Mexican exporters, and then confront Ottawa from a stronger position. Canada could arrive late to negotiations over automotive rules, steel, agriculture and economic security after the direction of the continental system had already begun to change. Mexico is now saying that bilateral talks cannot become the final architecture. But that does not mean Mexico will defend every Canadian interest. Mexico will protect Mexico. It wants to preserve access to the American market. It wants to defend its automobile industry. It wants to attract manufacturing investment. It wants relief from tariffs and protection from rules that could make Mexican production less competitive. If Washington offers Mexico an arrangement that protects Mexican factories while placing greater pressure on Canada, Mexico will face its own difficult calculation. That is why Canada should treat Mexico as a strategic partner, but not as a guaranteed shield. Now, listen to this very important question.
Is there more leverage between Canada and Mexico together against the U.S. Than there is with the two countries apart?
The answer is yes, but not because Canada and Mexico have identical interests. Their leverage comes from integration. The United States can pressure either country politically, but dividing the production system economically is much harder. If Washington makes Mexican assembly more expensive, American manufacturers also face higher costs. If it disrupts Canadian energy or industrial inputs, American refineries and factories feel the consequences. If it imposes rules that reduce cross-border investment, American companies operating across the continent lose flexibility. The three countries have spent decades building supply chains around the assumption that components, resources, and finished goods can move across the region under a common framework. Breaking that system into separate bilateral arrangements may give Washington greater negotiating control. But it could also increase costs, duplicate rules, and make North American production less competitive. That is Mexico's strongest argument to the White House. Trilateralism is not charity toward Canada or Mexico. It also serves the United States. American automakers depend on continental supply chains. American consumers depend on imported products and inputs. American farmers depend on Canadian and Mexican markets. American energy and manufacturing companies operate on both sides of the borders. Washington may hold the largest market, but it is still embedded inside the same system it is attempting to renegotiate. Listen to what this opinion says.
My view is that we need to stick together. I think that it's valuable for us to do so, and in other areas, we certainly demonstrate the value of how that comes to be.
But unity cannot remain a slogan. Canada is already at risk of falling behind. Mexico has been advancing its own discussions with Washington. It has been described by American officials as pragmatic and willing to engage directly with US concerns. Canada's negotiations have moved more slowly, and Washington has accused Ottawa of failing to offer the concessions it wants. That creates an uncomfortable situation. Mexico can publicly defend Canada's place in CUSMA while privately advancing its own position. Those two actions are not necessarily contradictory. Mexico wants to preserve the trilateral agreement because its manufacturing model depends on it. But it also wants to secure Mexican interests before uncertainty damages investment and exports. Canada must therefore do more than celebrate the return of the three amigos. Friendship is not a negotiating strategy. Ottawa needs direct engagement with Washington. It needs continuous coordination with Mexico. It needs sector-specific strategies for automobiles, steel, aluminium, agriculture, energy, critical minerals and digital trade. And it needs alternatives beyond North America, because CUSMA's uncertainty has increased the political risk of continental dependence. This connects directly to the wider TradEconomics story we have been following. The Gordie Howe Bridge showed us the gate. The CPKC Railway showed us the route. Canadian oil showed us the hard resource. CUSMA showed us the operating system. Trump then placed that operating system into zombie mode. Now Washington is testing whether it can negotiate with the system's two smaller members separately. Mexico's response is that separate conversations must eventually return to one North American framework. But saying the system must remain together is not the same as guaranteeing that every negotiation will treat all three countries equally. That is the danger for Canada. The United States does not need to formally remove Canada from CUSMA. It only needs to move faster with Mexico, establish new terms, and then present Ottawa with a continental framework that has already begun changing. Canada would technically remain inside the agreement, but it could enter the most important negotiations late. Trump did not need to destroy CUSMA to weaken it. He only needed to make certainty negotiable and place Canada and Mexico in separate rooms. Mexico has now said those separate discussions must not produce a separate trade system. That is meaningful resistance. But it is only the beginning. CUSMA is still alive, the operating system is still running. But zombie mode has entered its next phase. The next battle is no longer simply about whether the agreement survives until 2036. It is about whether one trilateral system can survive a decade of negotiations conducted two countries at a time. Can Canada and Mexico coordinate faster than Washington can separate their interests? Or will CUSMA remain trilateral on paper while becoming increasingly bilateral in practice? Share your view in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to TradEconomics, and turn on notifications for more analysis of the trade routes, supply chains, and political power behind the headlines.